This is Let's Talk About Mental Health, a weekly podcast about mental health and well-being, hosted by Jeremy Godwin. Let's talk about mental health, because the more we talk about it, the easier it gets. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Let's Talk About Mental Health, a podcast all about making the most of your mental health and well-being. I'm Jeremy Godwin, and I'm very glad that you could join me for this new episode. This week, I'm going to be talking about priorities, how to become crystal clear on what's important to you so that you can focus every day on what actually matters to you. So let's get talking. Let me start by asking you 3 questions. What are your priorities? What's really important to you? And what kind of person do you want to be? These are probably 3 of the most important questions that you could ever ask yourself, because the answers can help to guide your entire way of being if you allow them to. Now let me ask you this. How often do you take the time to ask yourself those 3 questions? If it's less than every month or every couple of months, it might be time to sit down and get in touch with what's really important to you and what really matters. This week, I'm going to be talking all about how to do exactly that, and why getting your priorities in order is an essential part of good mental health and well-being. Priorities. What are they? Your priorities are the things that you give the greatest importance to. It's the stuff that matters to you more than anything else in the world. Often for most of us, it's aligned to the people, places, and bigger picture concepts or spiritual notions that are of the greatest value to us. I see the notion of priorities as being closely linked to self-awareness and personal growth. In other words, it's about really understanding who you are by being brutally honest with yourself, and then challenging yourself to be the very best version of yourself that you can be at all times. Being crystal clear about who you are, who you want to be, and what your priorities are, and then consciously choosing to think, act and be in line with your priorities every single day is part of self-awareness and personal growth. Now, you may not get it right 100% of the time, but by being self-aware and patient with yourself, you will find it becomes second nature, which is when growth happens. The reason why I make a point to talk about priorities is that unless you are clear about who you are and what's genuinely important to you, you'll likely find yourself just going with the flow of life. Now, I am all for going with the flow, but when you do that, you have no control over where you end up. You can never completely control fate. Good luck trying. Have a go if you'd like. But you can certainly steer the ship in line with your priorities. In other words, don't let life just happen to you, but create your life around your priorities. Before we go any further, let's talk about what this topic isn't about. Working through your priorities isn't about creating some sort of ranking system for the things and people in your life. It's not a competition, and there are no winners or losers. Nor is being clear about your priorities an excuse to hide behind not trying new things or just being rigidly focused on one goal. Because if you do that, then you miss out on all of the surprising twists and turns that life has to offer. Very often, things will happen that might not seem in your best interest at the time, but later on, they can turn out to be just the thing that you needed to take you to the next step in your journey. So I'm a firm believer in remaining aligned to your priorities, whilst also keeping an open mind and heart. It's about balancing that piece of taking control of your fate, as well as letting fate take some control of you as well, if that kind of makes sense. The other thing I want to mention when I explain the notion of priorities is that your priorities do not have to be set in stone for all of eternity. People change and priorities change. In fact, they're up to you. If you want to change your life, change your priorities. If something is important enough to you, you'll find a way. There are lots of different examples of priorities. I tend to put them in 2 categories, external versus internal. So when we talk external, usually it's, things like your family, your friends, pets, your job, passions, hobbies, creativity, charity work, etc. The internal stuff is around you and your behaviors, your thoughts, and your actions. It's the stuff that people can see, as well as the stuff that only you ever know about, like what goes on in your head and what you truly think and feel. All of that stuff comes together to really tie up into a bundle of your priorities. Now, why is this related to mental health and well-being? Well, I think in our society, we have this perspective that happiness should be the end goal for everything that we do, as though it's some permanent state of bliss that can be achieved if we just do this one more thing or buy this one product or whatever it is. And the reality is that happiness is fleeting. It's not a permanent state. In fact, it's not some grand state to achieve, but instead it's something that we can find in all of the little moments that make up our day. Even if all of your problems were just to suddenly disappear overnight, I guarantee that you would find new ones before the month is out. So where priorities come in is about, instead of chasing happiness, instead of chasing all of these outcomes, we should be devoting our energy to becoming self-aware and to being the sort of person who we want to be. And you do that by understanding what's important to you, then setting your priorities accordingly. And that's what we're talking about this week. I chose this topic this week because I've been going through a lot of priority setting myself lately, resetting as well. Before I made the decision to leave my job at the end of August, I was having a lot of discussions with my partner about what I wanted to do with myself. Not just right now, but also for the rest of my life, I guess. And part of that was driven by the fact that I had somehow wound up back in the business world and in a management role, no less, which is something that I had told myself that I never wanted to get back into management again. But I ended up there because I made decisions for myself that were out of alignment with my priorities. When we first moved from Melbourne to the country back in 2015, I said to my partner that I didn't want to live here just to work full-time again, because that was going to take away the opportunity to make the most of living in such a beautiful part of the world. So I wanted to balance work with creative work. The reality of living in the country is it's a lot cheaper than living in the city. So that's something that we were able to actually consider. But what happened? I ended up back full-time work again. And look, I've got bills to pay like everyone else. But look, I have a choice on how I do that. So by refocusing myself and resetting my priorities, I'm now doing creative work that makes me feel more in line with the type of person I want to be and which taps into my creativity. Sometimes we need to think through what is really important to us and then realign our lives to make it a reality if we're not already where we want to be. And a lot of that involves having brutally honest conversations with yourself and listening to your gut instincts. Okay, so I said that this week we'll be talking about how to become crystal clear on what's important to you so that you can focus every day on what actually matters to you. So how do you do that? How do you become crystal clear on what's important to you? This is where my favorite R word comes in: reflection. If you don't hear me say this at least 16 times per podcast, there's something wrong. I've mentioned in other podcasts and blog posts that reflection is when you take the time to give something serious thought and consideration, and it's an amazing tool for increasing your self-awareness. Now, before I get into today's piece about priorities, let me just take a moment to say that I truly encourage reflection on a regular basis. At least once a week. Even better is to take 5 or 10 minutes at the end of every day and reflect on what worked well for you and what you could have done differently for a different outcome. Now, notice how I didn't focus on the negative there. It's not about things that went wrong. It's about identifying what the learning opportunities are. Reflection is your chance to have an honest conversation with yourself. You might like to write your thoughts down in a journal, or just grab your phone and use the Notes app and make a couple of notes. Whatever you do, do it without any judgment. So if you did or said something that you're not happy with, look for the lesson and use it as a chance to grow, rather than beating yourself up over something that you can't change. And by the way, if you did make a mistake, feel free to check out last week's podcast and blog all about making mistakes for some specific advice on how to tackle it. Anyway, back to the topic at hand, priorities. Defining your priorities involves being honest with yourself and making a list of what matters most to you. For many of us, Our priorities are directly connected to the people we love the most, which is great. However, I want to ensure that we're all clear that your priorities cannot be at your own expense. You need to be your highest priority, because if you don't look after you, who will? Now, I know this is a total cliche. It's been used about 3 million times in self-help stuff, but I'm going to say this anyway. This is the whole thing of when you're on a plane and they tell you to put on your own oxygen mask before you help others. There's a reason this one gets repeated a lot, because it's kind of common sense, but we forget it a lot. You are not going to be able to help anyone if you're passed out because you didn't think to look out for yourself first, and nobody needs to be a martyr. So, put your own oxygen mask on. In other words, look after yourself as your highest priority so that you can be there for other people. Now, when you're thinking about what your priorities might be, consider your home life, your closest loved ones, your family, your friendships, your community, as well as things like your work, your hobbies and passions, your spiritual beliefs, your general satisfaction with life. All of those things are important, and all of those things go in together. Basically, it can be whatever holds most value to you. Hopefully you know my guideline by now. If it doesn't hurt anyone, go for it. Let's go back to work that I mentioned just a moment ago. When we talk about work, it's important to make the distinction between doing work that pays the bills versus how your work makes you feel. We all have bills to pay, and some of us, myself included, have priorities that aren't tied up in our career status or the day-to-day of our jobs. Some of us love our jobs. Some of us get an absolute thrill out of our jobs, and that's great. However, some people are happy to just go to work, deliver a good job, which draws upon the best of their abilities, and then go home without working 60, 70, or 80 hours a week because their priorities lie elsewhere. And honestly, I've gotten to a point now where I think that's the right headspace to be in. It's about working to live rather than living to work. If your work gives you meaning and satisfaction, then fantastic, but don't let it define your identity. If your work doesn't give you meaning and satisfaction, that's okay too. As long as it doesn't make you miserable, it might simply be a means to an end. In other words, you might be happy just to go in, do your work, deliver well, deliver everything that's expected of you, walk out the door, leave your work at work, and go home and enjoy your home life. That is absolutely the definition of work-life balance. What I'm trying to say is that it's okay for your work not to even feature in your priorities if that's what feels right to you. Do not feel guilty about that. As long as your work doesn't suck the life out of you, then it's all good. I also want to say that I'm making this point about work here because the harsh reality is that most workplaces will cope just fine if and when you ever leave. A job is just a job. And I mean, I'm not trying to suck all the fun out of working in a job that you absolutely love, but the reality is that nobody is irreplaceable. So it's important to have a sense of perspective when you're thinking about what really matters to you. And to be perfectly honest, I don't think that many people would put work right at the top of their list if they're being honest with themselves. Feel free to prove me wrong. By all means, jump onto social media and let me know. In all seriousness though, again, let's be really honest, nobody in their right mind ever said on their deathbed, wow, I wish I had have worked more. Most people would be focusing on the things that mattered, which would tend to be more around the people that we love and the people that we cherish. So just bear that in mind when you're thinking about your priorities. Quite often in our 20s, 30s, and 40s, we get stuck into this cycle of defining ourselves by our work. And what I'm saying is, there is a way out of that, and that is to choose to prioritize what is important outside of work and really focus your energy and attention on that. So how exactly do you become crystal clear about what your priorities are? Let's go through a number of steps that you can follow, and I've got 8 steps to cover here. Step 1, reflect. What a surprise that I would start with that one. Reflect. Think about what's important to you and brainstorm a list, making it as long or as short as feels right for you. So that's step 1. Step 2, reflect again. Read through your list and ask yourself, what might you have missed? If you need to add more to the list, add more. Step 3, review. Now review each item individually and ask yourself, is this really important to me? And if so, why is it important to me? This isn't just a quick yes-no conversation. This is about really sitting and thinking and giving serious thought and consideration to every single item that you've come up with. If you're not sure why it's important to you, reflect and then reflect again. This is the time to dig deep. Don't just put something on your list for the sake of it. I want you to really ask yourself why each item is on your list and whether it remains relevant today. I did my own list recently again and realized that I was still including things that were more relevant when I lived in the city than where I live now. And it's been over 4.5 years since I left the city. Times change, people change, priorities change. So focus on now. Step 4 is rank. I want you to look at each item on your list and you're going to rank them. You do that by asking yourself, if I didn't have this in my life anymore, how would my life be? Now, if you couldn't imagine finding a way through life without it, it goes towards the top of your list. If you could find a way to function, okay, it goes towards the bottom of the list if it's something that you couldn't or wouldn't want to let go of, but you could find a way to function if you needed to. That goes down the bottom of the list. You don't have to rank them in order. This is not a competition. Just high, medium, and low tends to be more than enough to get a sense of importance. Now we're at step 5, refine. So you might decide to do this step, especially if your list is quite long, or you might decide to skip it altogether. And the step, like I said, is to refine. Ask yourself, if you had to choose between something at the top of your list and something towards the bottom, could you and would you? Now, nobody's asking you to go all Sophie's Choice here and rank your children or anything and pick one over the other, but this is a chance to think through what is really, really, really important to you rather than just what's important. We've all got things that are important, but this is about getting to the heart of what is absolutely core, fundamental importance in your life. The shorter your list, the better. Life is complicated enough without having to juggle 15 different priorities. Step 6, review. Look at your list and reflect for a moment. What does your list say about you? What does it say about who you are as a person? And more importantly, what does it say about the person that you want to be? So review your list in line with those thoughts. What does it say about you? What does it say about who you are as a person? And most importantly, what does it say about the person that you want to be? Step 7 is a continuation from step 6, and it is reconsider. So, is there anything on your list that is out of alignment with who you want to be? If there is, what do you need to do to change it? What do you need to make a priority in order to be the person that you want to be? And what do you need to do more of or less of? Let me give an example to illustrate my point here. It's an extreme example, but it was just one that I could think of that sort of made sense of the topic. If being sober is important to you, but then again so is going to the pub with your friends every Saturday to have a couple of drinks, then something has to shift in order for that to align with your priorities. So, what's more important, sobriety or the drinks? The answer is going to be different for everybody. For example, if you're able to drink in moderation, then you'll probably be able to answer quite differently than someone who struggles with moderation. Reconsider your list in line with who you want to be. That's the point that I'm making here. And when it comes to material items, if they happen to be on your list, be ruthless while you're reconsidering. If your house were on fire, you could probably only grab 1, maybe 2 things. So don't have a list as long as your arm. It's just stuff. Step number 8, the final step, refine further. If your list is still extensive, and I would generously define that as being double digits, and I'm being generous by saying that, if it is still extensive, refine, 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 and then refine some more. If you can, get it down to no more than 5 things. Now, when I say things, I mean including people, right? But it's just easier to say things to cover everything off. Why? Why get it down to no more than 5 if you can? Because it's easier to do the next bit with a small list than it is trying to juggle 18 things. Because the next bit is the hard part, but it's the most rewarding. Now, it's about what you do once you've followed all those steps, and it's about focusing all of your energy on those things. That might mean that you need to reset your life or even completely redesign it. For hints on resetting, check out my podcast and blog on resetting. Take a look at every aspect of your life and determine if it aligns with your priorities. If it does, great, do more of that. If it doesn't, change it. Here's another example. If your job is to sell shoddy products to people who don't need them, or if it involves taking advantage of vulnerable people in order to get a sale, and if your priority is to do no harm to others, then there's a clear disconnect between your reality and your priorities. So you need to make a choice to make a change and then actually make the change. It's not easy. Nobody said that it was, but it is necessary. Because using that example, if you work in a role that requires you to do shitty things, don't be surprised if a bit of that shittiness rubs off on you. Make choices that are aligned with your priorities. If you're doing a job that's draining the life out of you, but you've made a decision to prioritize your home and your family life, change. Put a priority on what and who you're grateful for and act accordingly. Let every action you take be aligned with what truly matters to you, and let everything else just be water off a duck's back. So, as we get towards the end of this week's topic of priorities, here are a few tips that I'd like to leave you with as I head towards the end of the episode. Number 1, only you can determine what truly matters to you, so never let anyone else tell you what your priorities should be. If it doesn't harm anyone, go for it. Number 2, material things won't ever deliver true happiness because they can't. They're just things. Those $1,200 Balenciaga sneakers don't make you a better person. They just make you someone willing to spend too much on footwear to advertise a brand on behalf of some company and to show other people that you spend too much money on footwear. Prioritize what really matters. And thirdly, design your life around your priorities. If spending time with your partner is your top priority, then maybe accepting that overseas job is probably going to throw a spanner in the works. Put your priorities first. So I'm going to close out with a quote that I'd encourage you to reflect on. And as always, when I talk about these reflection quotes, it's about taking a few moments to really give serious thought and consideration to the quote, thinking about how it applies to the topic, and more importantly, what it can potentially teach you in relation to the topic. This one's actually a pretty straightforward one with a few layers to it. It's a 3-word quote this week from Gandhi, and it is, action expresses priorities. Let me repeat that one more time. Action expresses priorities. Alright, so that is the end of this week's episode. Thank you so much. Just to summarize, your priorities are up to you. It's all about being clear on what truly matters to you and really understanding why, and then acting in line with your priorities every day. Because having that sense of clarity and purpose and structure around your focus is going to help you to make decisions that will support your mental health and well-being. So thank you so much for listening to this week's episode, all about priorities. Next week, I'll be talking about overthinking, which is definitely going to be a topic close to my heart. Until then, you can find Let's Talk About Mental Health on social media, on Instagram, Facebook, and Pinterest at LTAMH Official. That's LTAMH Official. Also, head over to read the blog on the website, which is letstalkaboutmentalhealth.com.au. Thank you very much for listening to this week's episode. I hope you enjoyed it and talk to you again next week.